what about the 500 people that saw him in the town over the next 6 weeks?
Did you talk to those people?
No.
So who knows what they believed, but who knows what they actually believed? Who knows how they said it? Who knows if it was a religious thing? Look, there's people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things.
We don't have any explanation of peer-reviewed literature pointing to mass hallucinations.
You mean we don't have any examples from peer-reviewed literature of mass hallucinations? Okay.
Yeah.
But just for Jesus, this book was saying the reason why they believe the historical accuracy of it is because his haters and the disciples were both saying the same thing. So you have the Romans saying, yeah, this is what happened, who hated him, and at that point would be like, get this guy out of here. He's basically causing a revolt. That's why we have to kill him. It's like somebody getting, a protester today. Mm-hmm. They were like, this guy, he's out.
Right. And
so they were saying, yeah, what you're saying happened. And then the disciples are saying it. Like a big thing is the resurrection, right? People say, really? He resurrected from the dead? Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, everybody agreed, haters, Romans, and the Jewish people, everybody agreed he died. That's 100%. That's why when they stab him and you say water came out, it wasn't water, it was fluid from his lungs because he was dead. And that's what would happen to you or I when we die, is we have this lung fluid that comes out. So that's what they said, oh, that's water. And that's what they made him divinity, but it was like a natural thing. He's dead, everyone agrees. And you say, well, they buried him in a tomb, and then the next day, 3 days later, the tomb's empty. And people are like, so, that made up. And they say 500 people saw him in the town. Romans and Hebrew, they saw him over the next couple of weeks. They 500 independently sourced people, real, like corroborated, 500 people saw him. So you say, okay, so there's that. And then the other conspiracy theory is like, well, the disciples robbed his body. The disciples just robbed his body because they don't want him. They would hand over crucifixion victims to like the wild dogs. That used to be the way it was. If you got crucified, throw you in a pit, wild dogs eat you, or leave you on the cross, birds will eat you. That's how we deal with you. So they're like, that's why they were taking his body. And then you see that, well, that's probably not what happened. And the Romans themselves acknowledge there's no body in that tomb that we put in there 3 days ago. The body is not there, and we did it. So in order to save ourselves, we're going to say the apostles robbed it. But in reality, that's just a conspiracy because the apostles would have no reason to rob it.
So the Romans think the apostles robbed the body.
That's a conspiracy.
Why do you say conspiracy? Well, you're saying a conspiracy to diminish the story.
No. I meant conspiracy in the sense of that's what people say as a reason why the
Did the Romans say that?
The Romans have said that. Yeah. The Romans said that back then, and then I guess conspiracy is the wrong word because I'm not like it's one story, one explanation. I'll say explanation of.
But if you looked at it, like, what's the most logical explanation? Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life, or the most logical explanation that someone took his body? Because that's what the Romans said. I'm saying that is that came back to life
one time, and I'm not saying I'm crazy about it. I'm just saying, you know what? After reading that book, there was enough things that happened that historical scholars who aren't religious, some are believers, some are not,
right,
are like, this existed and this happened.
But you're talking about historical scholars from 2,000 years ago, right, and their knowledge of science.
What was that face, Matthew? What's going on? Let's start to break it down. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, he's not talking about historical scholars from 2,000 years ago. So that's a big thing. He's the facts that he's talking about, that Jesus was dead on the cross, that his body was gone from the tomb, that he was buried. These are facts that modern historians look back and they say, we have really good historical reasons to believe this happened. So this isn't ancient people saying, oh yeah, we're convinced of this only. It's also modern historians saying, no, that Jesus is a real person. He was dead on the cross. His body was buried, and then it was gone from the tomb.
Let's see what else goes down here.
Science and biology and life and the universe itself was extremely limited.
Right.
And so their entire fundamentals, like everything they believed in, was based on mythology. Everything was based on gods and demons and.
Okay, so then what about this? All right, fine. What if the Romans? Okay, they made it up, right? The Romans are correct. The disciples took the body, who everyone agreed was dead. What about the 500 people that saw him in the town over the next 6 weeks?
Did you talk to those people?
No.
So who knows what they believed? But who knows what they actually believed? Who knows how they said it? Who knows if it was a religious thing? There's people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things, and there's people that you could give them false memory. False memory is a real thing. Someone can convince you that something happened that didn't happen.
Right.
It's real. It's like they've demonstrated how to do it. We all know friends that have a memory of something, and you go, that's not what happened, and then you say your version of it, and then everybody has to like figure out what really happened.
Right.
You're like, do you remember that time we were at the game and you said this? I didn't say that. Like, that was not me.
Yeah.
That was
Is it true what he's saying here that mass hallucination of the same thing is actually common?
No, not at all. I mean, we just don't have this sort of common explanation of this. In fact, we don't have any explanation of peer-reviewed literature pointing to mass hallucinations.
You mean we don't have any examples from peer-reviewed literature of mass hallucination? Okay, that's interesting. That's what I had heard, but I, again, wanted to now that I get the chance to rub shoulders and be like, all right, let's compare notes here. So very cool. Let's keep going.
Mike.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? Yeah. You remember Mike lost his job?
Right.
He was drunk. Do you remember? And they're like, oh, yeah. Like, you thought it was me. Like, you put it on me. It was like,
Yeah.
we change things. Like,
Right.
people change things.
Right.
They also, your memory becomes a memory of your memory and not the actual memory itself.
True.
It becomes a memory of the story you're telling.
Right.
And so if this person was this significant religious guru figure like Jesus was, right? And he really does have this amazing view of how humanity can live in harmony. And he really does talk to people about this. And he really does preach forgiveness. And he really does treat everybody like they're the same. Paupers and hookers,
Right.
and everyone. Everyone's just God's children, loved. When that guy's gone, you're going to miss him, man. You're going to miss him bad.
Yeah.
You really do have a fundamental view of reality that's based entirely on myth. And you have connected this guy to the Son of Christ, or the Son of God, rather. This is this figure that is brought here to save us. And the Romans took him from us and killed him. And now he died for our sins and the whole thing.
Right.
If you have that in your head, and then someone says, I saw him, like, I saw him too.
Right.
Like, if people see the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich. People see things.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean those things aren't there.
Right.
It doesn't mean that isn't a vision, but it also does mean that people see things that
Yeah.
aren't. And there's a lot of people that are not that bright.
Yeah.
They're not smart, and they're easily led, and they're easily manipulated. It also doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't real.
Right.
Like, all those things. But it's just the likelihood of someone coming back to life is very low.
Right.
The likelihood of someone taking his body is very high.
Right.
So if you use like Occam's razor, the simplest solution,
Right.
the simplest answer is probably what you're searching for. It's probably that someone took the body.
Going to the idea that people would just misremember something like this. Well, you don't really misremember your Savior coming back from the dead. That's not like I was drunk at the party or something like that. This is like a life-changing experience, and not just one experience, but there are records of multiple appearances of Jesus in the scriptures of him after raising from the dead, interacting with his disciples, making a meal for them, eating with them, allowing them to touch his side. And this variety and level of experiences cannot be adequately explained by some sort of grief hallucination. And that's the other thing that he said is, you want this guy to come back. You sort of trick yourself into believing that. But when we look at some of the people that Jesus appeared to, some of them don't fit that description at all. We have Paul, who is a persecutor of the early church. He doesn't want Jesus to come back. He wants him to stay dead. And yet he has this experience. And then James, the brother of Jesus, who's a skeptic, and yet he comes to believe because Jesus appears to him. Yeah. So we have early records. We have the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which goes back to within months of the crucifixion, saying that Jesus had appeared to all of these people.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is that what he's saying, in my opinion, is not actually bad in the sense that it is kind of a logical way of saying, well, let's suppose that something supernatural didn't happen here. Could it be the case that there's a bit of wish fulfillment, there's a bit of grieving? It's kind of, I feel that that's it's a question that I would ask as well, but it just doesn't account for the breadth of what we do know did happen in history. Yeah. It doesn't actually fully explain all of that by any stretch. I always go back to the point of, if he is risen, then he is alive and he is still doing things and meeting people. And that's what the record of the last 2,000 years also indicates. Yeah. So anyways, we're preaching to the choir here, but this is good. Let's go into it.
Where do they put it?
Well, you could put it anywhere. Like, no one knows where Genghis Khan is buried.
No. Genghis
Khan, they did the wildest thing with him. They sent a pack of people to bury Genghis Khan. Then they sent another pack of people to kill the people everybody that went to Genghis Khan's funeral was murdered. They all got murdered by another group of people. And then those group of people got murdered by a separate group to make sure that no one had any understanding at all about where Genghis Khan was buried.
Oh my God.
To this day, no one knows where he was.
I also didn't know that.
Thousands of people died to hide his burial.
But it's got to be somewhere in Mongolia.
Somewhere, yeah.
Yeah.
No one knows.
Yeah. I
They could do LiDAR over the entire country and figure it out.
Well, there'll be somebody will proclaim that they found it at some point.
Maybe.
They
have no idea. Look at this.
Whoa.
Boom. Look how they're sliding all over.
What is that?
Some random thing at the
That
end.
guy can't stop his car. Look, it's just going to slide.
Okay.
But so in contrast to Genghis Khan, Jesus is buried in Jerusalem, the very city where he's crucified. And he's buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council, which is an embarrassing idea because this is the council that condemned him to death. And so we have good reason to believe that it's true. And yet, so everybody knows where he's buried. And yet when they claim that he is risen from the dead, they don't go to the tomb to say, oh, look, here's your risen Messiah. He's still in the tomb. They don't do that because he's not there. The tomb is empty. And so what you have here, he brought in Occam's razor. What you have here is you either have one very logical explanation. He said this, it's more logical to believe otherwise. I don't think it's more logical. I think it's more logical to believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be, that this perfect Messiah who preached like no one had ever seen before, these values of self-sacrifice and loving your enemy, these things that we applaud today. I think the most logical thing is to say that guy is who he says he was. And then to say the very one simple explanation is all of this is explained by the fact that he actually rose from the dead, that he actually was who he claimed to be, versus Occam's razor. You have to give an explanation for how did the disciples have these experiences that convinced them that Jesus rose from the dead? Where did the body go? How were the Romans convinced that that the disciples had stolen the body when the disciples had no motive, means, or opportunity to do something like that? And the reason he calls it a conspiracy theory before is, why would you do that if your only motivation is to be essentially martyred for your faith? I mean, the disciples had nothing to gain by stealing the body of Christ. They faced persecution and death for believing that he rose from the dead. Yeah. So actually, it just complicates everything to believe that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead.
What you're saying is, looking at the historical data points that we do definitely know are the case, you have to string together more alternative theories to make sense of the historic record, right? Kind of the minimal facts, the 4 to 6 or 7, depending on who you talk to, minimal facts approach. But I think what he's talking about when he is talking about Occam's razor is not how to best make sense of those different historical data points. I think what he's talking about is that I think that Joe Rogan's worldview is still basically naturalistic. Sure. And so he's like, dude, even if there is some gap in the historical record, if my alternative is basically like a magical explanation, then it's Occam's razor simple in the sense that I don't believe in the supernatural, and I'm not going to include this supernatural element to the historical record if I don't believe in the supernatural, if I don't believe that there is anything supernatural to begin with. So I think from his perspective, he's like, that's totally off the table to begin with. That concept that Jesus actually rose from the dead, proved that he was a truth teller, and what he claimed about himself is that he and the Father are one, that he, is going to a place, I go to prepare a place for you, and in my Father's house are many mansions. Like, all of that is, I think, in the category in Joe's brain of fairy tale, fantasy, magic, nonsense. And so I think from that perspective, he's like, we have a problem here.
I get where he's coming from with that, but I do think, Richard Swinburne points out that when you're considering the probability of a particular event, you need to consider both the prior probability and the probability given the evidence for the event. And so, for any random person, if they're gone from their grave, what's the most likely explanation? Well, they were taken from the grave by somebody else, or, some sort of accident happened or something like that. But for the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, the perfect teacher, the man who performed miracles, for that guy who claimed that he was going to die and rise again, what's the probability that guy actually was who he claimed to be? Actually very high.
Yeah, and I think we'll have to get into this in other videos because, there's a lot of things that the total matter-only view don't explain. And so I think that, again, if you sort of presume matter only, you're in a more difficult philosophical position. But then that leads us into our next video.